This is your home for St. Cloud State hockey, keeping you up to date on the NCHC.
One-timer coming, they score! Ripped in! A bomb from Pervix!
Women's WCHA.
So Dana Rasmussen fires and she scores! Dana Rasmussen for the Huskies alongside
The National Hockey League.
Dwayne Kaprizov in for a chance to win it! He scores! Kirill, the thrill is for real! Welcome to the NHL, a game winner!
And everything from the state of hockey.
St. Cloud Cathedral is now 42.6 seconds away from wrapping up the school's first ever title.
Welcome to the Huskies Warming House Podcast Den. The Huskies Warming House podcast is also brought to you by the Soda Pod, home of NCAA college hockey news and more. Stay wild and up to date with new episodes throughout every week. Find them on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and other podcast platforms. And welcome into the Huskies Warming House podcast, episode 201 here in the den. Nick Maxon alongside Noah Grant. And Nick, yeah, we've had some good shows in the past. Well, have we had some good shows in the past? I think we've had some good shows in the past.
I think what you mean is we've had some good content to talk about or good weekends to talk about in the past.
Yeah, Chief, this ain't one of them.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is one of those, we actually didn't even clip any game recaps for this weekend. I mean, it was a tough weekend. If you want to be technical about it, I think it was 4 combined goals between the men and women total this weekend, and both of them came in the men's games. I mean, it just slightly disappointing on the men's side, I think, from the spread and just the uncompetitiveness of both games. And on the women's side, we thought they were going to get hot at the right time. Well, they ice cold, unfortunately. So
Well, and their offense has been ice cold all second half, right? No, I think if you want, and we'll dive into it deeply, but I do think just injuries, especially in the back, caught up with them. I really do. And at the end of the day, the two that were injured, Grace Wolf, who can skate, can move the puck out, I think really did hinder their ability to move plays in transition to skate through the ice. Jump up into the offense. It hurt. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, like I said, painful weekend all around. I think this weekend, as you mentioned, we'll talk about it, is very much a case of inherent or created deficiencies, meaning injuries versus like actual systems and structure. All of those came out for both of the teams this weekend. Unfortunately, it all just kind of laid it to itself. The other thing to kind of mention here as we jump in, I mean, the women, of course, losing by 2 goals yesterday. Otherwise, the margins were 4, 5, and 5 respectively on the weekend. So yeah, kind of a tough one. But nonetheless, we're recording this show on Sunday, March 3rd, actually at the tail end of the Gopher game, which on the women's side, which should kind of seal the deal for what we should see as far as WCHA play in terms of the final grouping there. In fact, just a quick glance here early on, and I kind of wonder, 3-0 was the final for the Gophers. What a good showing from Mankato, though, by the way. On the women's side, they actually played very, very well. Nothing to really hang their hats on. I thought they got better and better as the season kind of went along. So
they did.
But with that being said, we're going to start on the men's side here. We've got one more week of NCHC play left upcoming this week before we hit playoff time for the men's side as well. And we start with Center Ice View News and Notes presented by HuskiesIllustrated.com and the Soda Pod. Center Ice View News and Notes. Center Ice View provides you with the best coverage of St. Cloud State Huskies hockey from game notes, recaps, photos, and more. Go to CenterIceView.com. Episode 201 in the den. Nick Maxon alongside Noah Grant. Nick, we start on the men's side here, and Yeah, not exactly what the men's team was hoping for. They have very much been bolstered by the first half they had in the NCHC.
100%.
Christmas could not have come at a worse time for this team. We've been accustomed right now to a very roller coaster ride. I think even more so than 2019-20 when you and I were there, where the team was kind of rebuilding off of the best year in program history to that point, and certainly statistically still, if you look back, still the best year for the Huskies. But I don't know that we've ever been a part of a season that's had so much ebb and flow and swing. We've had seasons where they've had a little bit of a swoon. They've looked not great. Last year is a great example where they didn't look great, and then suddenly the last week of the regular season, they suddenly looked good, and they carried that through and had a pretty decent push to the finish. But before we get to recapping the NCHC games and the standings and everything, Nick, we've talked about alarm bells before, single alarm bells. Is this 5 alarm bell territory? Do Huskies fans overall have a right to be really worried and concerned after a weekend in which they lose by a combined -9 goal differential?
Not 5 alarm, but not that far off. And again, like you said, let's take a step back. Denver is a top 5 team in the country. They're good, right?
Took them a while to heat up. Yeah.
Problem is, they weren't even at full strength either. Remember, their top 2 centers, Massimo Rizzo, he was out, and I'm trying to remember who the other one was out too, but their top 2 centers were also not in their lineup, and they still handled the Huskies pretty efficiently throughout the weekend. And I think, Noah, that's where the concern is. It's not that you lost the games. I think if we're talking 2-1, 1-0 games, obviously you still want the W's, but it's more the manner that it happened, right? I mean, Denver came in and took care of business and did it in convincing fashion. And I think that's where the concern is with Huskies fans. And I think you and I would share that there is some concern here. Yeah. And I do think, especially in the second half here, what we've seen is, number one, a rookie goaltender who is showing a bit of the freshman, his youth, I should say, right? You can also see that the lack of size on the back end, I think, is also playing the part. And remember, we lost Brendan Bushy, guys like Spencer Meyer, Andre Trable, who had some size and length to him on the back end. He went no longer with the club. And obviously the offense wasn't there either. So it is not a great time for the Huskies to feel like they weren't even in a essentially competitive matchup with this squad. And now they put themselves in a position. And Noah, I'll ask you this. I got a text from Josh Wheeler yesterday, who was a really great dude. Went to school with him up at St. Cloud, but board ops of WCCO. And essentially he asked me, is this make or break for the Huskies? And I said, no, Denver's a good team. You need, I didn't say I think a win would be nice, but I don't think a loss hurt. I still feel like you're not in the worst position, but you're certainly not in the best. But I did say that if you do drop both, the make or break is now this upcoming weekend with the Bulldogs. Do you share that same sentiment, or do you really think that yesterday was a more important game than, shall we say, maybe I am saying? You
know what? At first, I kind of went back and I was like, it's just one of those where the Huskies really need to regroup. They need to be better, and that kind of sort of thing. There's one thing that really changed my mind, Nick. A little thing called the pairwise.
Yeah.
Huskies dropped to 14 here. They're right ahead of Western Michigan at 15. Remember, St. Cloud entering last weekend was right where CC was at 11. They have provided themselves a very small cushion. First of all, if St. Cloud drops more, one, if maybe even not both, I don't know, this upcoming weekend might be 2 must wins for the pairwise. And including the first round of the quarterfinals, St. Cloud has put themselves in a spot that is uncomfortable. They had a really good chance. Denver is tied for 3. I think they're technically 4 right now. They're a number 1 seed in the country. That's not a great spot to be in. And that's where A lot of the deficiencies, as you mentioned, that we noticed early on with this team, we wanted to originally take the perspective of, okay, they started with a rocky start, took them a while to figure it out. They're kind of running on all cylinders, a little bit of pushback in the second half. I think my stance has now changed to, you know what? November and December was a bit of a misnomer. I think this team has a little bit more deficiencies than maybe we thought, and we wanted to ignore them when we hit the Christmas break. Your example about this team lacking a bit of size in the back end, I think, is a great example, especially with a young goaltender. I think we've seen a lot this season compared to years past. How many teams, when St. Cloud is under duress, they get to the middle of the ice. They get towards the blue paint. They have a much easier time getting towards the house, essentially, in St. Cloud's end than maybe we've seen in years past with some of those bigger bodies on the back end. And we've talked about it where, Brendan Bushy, you brought him up, right? And this is no disrespect to Brendan. Not a flashy hockey player, not a guy you look at that you're going to be like, oh, this guy's going to take over a hockey game. Offensively, he's going to have 2 points tonight, and, the Huskies are going to ride his offensive wave through. No, I mean, he's the type of guy that, in hockey terms, you wouldn't want to find in a dark alley all alone, right? He just, physicality to a T. St. Cloud is missing a little bit of that right now, and against a really good team like Denver, who we also thought at the beginning of the year, in fact, we had a question about it in our mid-season predictions. Was Denver going to be in a home ice spot? Well, yeah, the Pios turned into the team we thought they were going to be. And they certainly look very good. I think that's the other thing to pull from this is the first loss on Friday to Western a week ago really hurts. Denver is really good. That's the other thing that's slightly misleading about the weekend is the Pios are good, and they showed that they were very good this weekend. But to have a -9 goal differential on home ice for the Huskies, that's a big margin that I don't know that we've seen in quite a while. And it puts them in an interesting spot coming up this weekend. Also, the NCHC in general, Nick, is just in a weird spot. We'll get to the games in the standings because everything is really kind of flipped on its head a little bit. But Nick, I guess before we get there, I guess, do you kind of see it in similar fashion? Does this team have more deficiencies that were masked, or are they better than this and they just have not put together a complete package in a little while?
This is tough because I think the deficiencies that we predicted that would be there are still there. I'm not as much on your side as there are more deficiencies. I am, though, a bit concerned about the execution of what they're trying to do, and that's what's hurting them a bit. And again, I think, let's be honest, right? And then again, this is no disrespect to Isaac Posh or Dominic Bassi, but I do think, there was some Huskies fans that were questioning, hey, you pulled Isaac Posh on Friday and then you go right back to him on Saturday. That's not that uncommon, especially with a young goaltender, because you're giving him a chance to sort of, wipe the slate clean, right? You say, yep, this was a one-off. Let's get you back out there. Let's put that in the back of our heads by having a good showing. And as you mentioned, Denver is a good hockey team. I think that's one thing we have to continue to emphasize is that they're a number one seed, most likely in the Parrots coming up for a reason. They're good. Again, they didn't look that way in the first half, although we started to show signs after the holiday break, and now it looks like they're running on all cylinders right now, and that's scary, right? But I think for St. Cloud, they're just the deficiencies plus the execution, when you combine those, is where we're at right now. Yeah. The only saving grace that I have, Noah, is that with a team led by Brett Larson, this coaching staff, RJ, Anga, everybody, is that this is going to motivate them for this weekend. Yeah. Right. Now, mind you, the Bulldogs earlier this year, and we'll obviously touch on it earlier, it was not, a comfortable time against these Bulldogs earlier this season. And you do sort of wonder, after kind of getting their chops cleaned a little bit this weekend, if they will be playing with a bit of an edge, number one. Number two, they're watching the standings too, right? It would be, we know that they know what position that they're in. And I do think you're going to see some desperate hockey this weekend because, unfortunately, as you mentioned, they're in a position where they're going to have to play with desperation, not just this upcoming weekend, but as you mentioned, even in the quarterfinal. I think they have to make it to St. Paul, or else they're probability of going onto an NCAA tournament bid is in serious jeopardy.
St. Cloud is kind of in that same boat too, though, which is kind of an awkward thing to talk about. The other thing that's interesting, Saturday, the Huskies outshoot Denver by 15. It was 7 on Friday. St. Cloud put up almost 40 shots on goal on Saturday, too. They did not have a period in which they had single-digit shot volumes. At any point this weekend, Denver only had one period in which they eclipsed the 10-shot mark per period. Interesting. But before we get I mean, quality over quantity, certainly. But
right. But also you can make the argument too, not to cut you off, but it could be part of the game plan too. Let's throw everything on net. Let's crash. Let's, be the Dave Shyack grease pan type stuff. And again, when you talk about execution, right, maybe that's what it was. We're getting the rubber towards the crease, just wasn't, getting those second and third opportunities, those loose pucks. Maybe it's, that part of winning puck battles and finding the way to get the puck in the back of the net. So maybe that's exactly what they wanted to know again, but it was just the part one of part two that had to be done, and they weren't able to finish off the secondary.
Yeah, well, before we get to those games, let's take a look at the rest of the NCHC, who was in action this past weekend. Omaha narrowly escaped Friday, 4-3 against Miami. I still, and 2-1 on Saturday. Nick, I still maintain this. I don't expect them to win a series. I think Miami is going to have a bit more pushback in their opening series, which looks like it's going to be North Dakota. So, that would be my guess. But
we can agree to disagree on that. And it's not more or less why I say that more about Miami. It's more about North Dakota.
Okay, well, we'll see. On the other side of things here, Western Michigan losing to the aforementioned Fighting Hawks 5-3 on the first night and then 3-0 on the second night. Western Michigan, again, similar to the Huskies, in a bit of a downward spiral right now. On the other side of things, Duluth wins 3-2 in a shootout on Friday. CC comes right back with a 4-1 gut punch in regulation on Saturday at Robeson Arena. Duluth, one of the few teams to solve CC at home, technically, not technically, in quite a while. On that Friday night. So keep an eye on that one. Other things that we pay attention to here is, how about the NCHC standings now? North Dakota atop the grouping with 49 points. I believe they actually clinched the Penrose.
They did.
Mathematically, yep. 7 points is the difference. I thought I saw the trophy out on Saturday. Very good hockey team, obviously. Denver right behind now at 42. St. Cloud's fate still in hand, though. I mean, if you want to be technical about it, 40 points for the Huskies in third, although right behind them in four. How about the CC Tigers at 38? Other than that, Omaha at 5 at 34. It would take a pretty monumental weekend from the Mavs to try to jump, so we might have our top four, just saying. And the Huskies
need a point, right? They need a single point to make it a non-contentious, right? Because doesn't Omaha hold the tiebreaker?
Yeah, I think head-to-head is part of one of the initial pieces of that. I'd have to look at the tiebreaker. Yeah, but
if you look at the conference win-losses, they're equal at 11 too. So that's,
I think I speak for both of us, Nick, when I say if St. Cloud is ever in that position at the end of the weekend, that's just disappointing.
Correct.
Plain
100%.
Plain and simple. Western Michigan at 31, they will climb no higher than 5th. And then Minnesota Duluth at 23. Looks like they're destined to finish in 7th. Again, I don't know who predicted that, but and Miami at 7 in that final spot. Speaking of the games that are upcoming, though, that is a good idea to kind of take a look here and see what's coming up this upcoming weekend, shall we say. And it is Miami who's going to travel to Western Michigan. So things could get interesting in terms of the 5 and 6 spot there. Duluth, of course, will have St. Cloud. We talked about that. And then North Dakota will actually face Omaha. Colorado College will face Denver. So we still could actually see a ton of fluctuation. I shouldn't say a ton, but a fair amount of fluctuation before everything is all said and done here, Nick. All of the matchups lend themselves to, potential outcomes that could really change a lot of things. So certainly a lot of work for the Huskies here. Let's talk about last weekend, which was unfortunately one that wasn't exactly the greatest, of course, as we kind of mentioned. 6-2 was the final in this one. Of course, on Friday, the start of March, Huskies attendance of just under 3,700. St. Cloud outshoots Denver 34-27 in this one, 13-12, 10-9, 11-6, despite being outscored 3-0, 1-0, and then 2-2 dead even in the third. Both teams a power play goal on 2 and 3 tries respectively. Pretty much par for the course, almost dead even in face-off wins and losses. Again, this is a game where I don't think the box score necessarily matches what we saw. 4-0 after periods 1 and 2. It was 3-0 after the first, including a power play goal from Denver early on, 3.5 minutes in. Single goal in the second period. The Huskies get one back at the 3:19 mark of period number 3. Adam Ingram's ninth from Carl Falk and Tyson Gross. Denver punched right back 2 minutes later. And then the Huskies grabbed their power play goal. Tyson Gross, a multi-point game for him. Dylan Anhorn, Vieti Miettinen also points 3 minutes later. And then the empty netter to seal the deal on that opening night. Of course, Matt Davis, 32 of 34 for him. And then, as we mentioned, Dominic Bassi saw 17 of 19, and Isaac Posh early on. Just numbers to forget. I don't think he had a ton of help, Nick. We kind of talked about that. 3 goals on 7 shots, Just not a lot of help. And then on Saturday, let's just kind of get through the pain here. 7-2 was the final. 38-23 were the shots. Attendance of just under 4,300. 10-5, 14-9, 14-9 respectively in each period. Neither team scored on the power play in 3 and 2 tries respectively for Denver and St. Cloud. Denver 1-0 and 2-0 in periods 1 and 2, and then 4-2 to cap off the finish. St. Cloud was almost dominant in the face-off circle too. Again, that's where I talked about just an interesting game. Huskies are down 1-0 late on a 4-on-4 goal after period number 1. They're down 3-0 after the second, and then the floodgates open wide up. 6-0 at one point before the Huskies are able to add a couple. Mason Salquist and Vieti Miettinen, their 5th and 15th respectively. Werner Miettinen, Zach Okabe, Jack Rogers, Mason Reiners, all with assists over the course of that game. Matt Davis only letting in 2 on 38 shots, and Isaac Posh, no help, unfortunately. 7 goals allowed in that one. He was in for the entire one. 23 total shots for the Denver Pioneers, Nick. I mean, that's pretty much it. We don't have any video recaps. It's just the score kind of speaks for itself. I guess the bigger thing is, what do you take from the games this weekend where the stat sheet didn't exactly unfavor the Huskies? I think we've seen in weekends past where St. Cloud has gotten away with some games where maybe they weren't the better team. And certainly they weren't the better team this weekend. But the fashion in which it happened was not akin to the way we've seen them lose games this year otherwise. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think, you and I, we've done this for now so long that, yeah. In other words, folks, that's why, right? He's just sick of my rear end. So at the end of it, no. Context is important, right? Whenever you look at a stat line. And I think if there's anything you can take away is, well, the Denver Pioneers finished and we didn't.
Yep.
Plain and simple, right? Now, how did they finish? How much was it goaltending? I think Posh, we could say respectfully, this probably wasn't a weekend that he probably was as sharp as he wanted to be. Defensively, too, let's not forget Denver has a ton of talent up front. That if you get him odd man rushes, if you get him in one-on-one situations, there was a couple of goals when I watched the recaps where it was one-on-one. It wasn't anything you could call flashy or, someone beat completely clean, but then a perfectly placed shot and goaltender just can't catch up with it. Right. It's concerning still in the sense of that these are the types of plays you're getting beaten on, right? No, and that is, you feel like you're doing the right things. You feel like, you're putting yourself in a position to capitalize on chances you're creating, and whatever you're doing isn't working. And then all of a sudden, before you feel you can get into the game, you're behind 3 or 4-0. When you're trailing that much too, that doesn't help. The Huskies this year, if you go even going back to the non-conference schedule, this was a team that we saw struggle in terms of when they trailed, right? So I think that's been a consistent thing all year. The question now is, and I know I want to kind of pass you this, is Brett Larson's got a bit of a dilemma on his hands. And I say that in the sense of, how do you approach this weekend? Not only from a goaltending perspective, where, you were going away from Dominic Bassi. Isaac Posh looked pretty good against Western Michigan, but then a really good Denver Pioneer squad comes in and actually he just gets lit up right now. Granted, I think we both understand there's probably some youth to some of those numbers, but this is an important weekend, not only for the paralyzed, but also just for their confidence, right? This is I don't know how you would approach it, but I'm curious as to if you were the head coach, how would you approach this weekend?
Well, I thought it was interesting. We talked about, again, especially the game on Saturday not matching up with Friday. And this is where it's perplexing, almost in a similar fashion to the way the women's team has been. And some of the stuff coming actually here from the rink live, because I was pulling this up earlier and I wanted to know what Brett Larson said, because one of the things that we've always appreciated about Brett is he doesn't really pull punches. You know, when his team isn't exactly playing the best that they should have. I mean, a fluky goal at the end of period number 1, but I mean, at the same time, the Huskies, again, started the game well. Like we talked about, shot volume was definitely there. They were heavily out shooting Denver for the first 2 periods, but it's almost a similar story with the women's team. It doesn't matter how much better you play on night number 2. If you don't get the job done, like at some point, it just has to happen. And Brett knows that, obviously, and the whole team knows that. And, you know, I think with Isaac Posh, too, and, you know, having kind of a tough ride and support, you know, especially at the tail end of that hockey game on Saturday, you know, you go back to back with him and, you know, unfortunately get burned this weekend, but that's a big building block. And I know a lot of fans will wonder, what do you mean building block? We're in the thick of an NCHC playoff race and trying to get into the NCAA tournament. I mean, Dominic Bassey, this is it for him. Mm-hmm. You know, when you're looking towards the future, it's nice to be able to get both goaltenders in the rotation regardless, but also to be able to look and say, we got Isaac Posh a couple of rotations in his first full season playing, and kind of got him accustomed to, hey, we went back-to-back with you. You didn't play, unfortunately, to a level that at least allowed the Huskies to maybe steal a game that they were probably playing a little bit better in initially, and it gives him a little bit of that experience. I think if you're Brett Larson and company, you have to really laud the fact that the response, and I think the starts to a lot of hockey games have still been really good for this men's team. It's just been the execution, because they're seeing the same things that we're seeing. They start a hockey game really strong. They outplay an opponent. They get a shitty bounce at the end of a period. They don't, you know, they're not able to execute. You know, at some point early on in the hockey game, they go down 1 or 2-0, and then they're like, oh, here we go again. We're chasing the hockey game. You and I know very well, Nick, you just got to come to some of my men's league games in years past. When you start chasing the game and you go, oh, we can beat this team, and then you're down 2-3-0 in the first 3 minutes, you're like, oh, well, I guess it's just time for the beer, right? I mean, it's just like you start to grip the sticks a bit tighter, and you realize that the mountains.
Felt that way with some intramural games that we played on against. So
yeah, honestly, and
especially after a fractured ankle. So
the mountain starts to look just higher and higher in those hockey games. We talked about the women's team, although it didn't pay off for them this weekend, but how important it was last weekend against Bemidji State to win a couple of games where they opened the spread up a little bit and feel what it was like to be in control, in the driver's seat a little bit. I think St. Cloud, since the second half, just hasn't really had that type of consistency. In the first half, yes, we can talk about momentum and them playing the right way and figuring things out, but when you start to string 3-4 wins together, let's not forget the second NCHC matchup of the season was Western Michigan. The Huskies traveled to Kalamazoo, which has historically been a very poor building for them. They win a nail-biter on Friday night. They kind of slam the door shut on Saturday. Just like that, yes, it was Miami and Western, but they win 4 in a row after a fairly abysmal non-conference start, which is kind of going to burn them in the pairwise right now. But they started to get that momentum. They started to get that taste of getting the job done on Friday, putting the nail in the coffin on Saturday. Now they're the ones who got thrown in the coffin and they're scratching trying to get out. And it's like that's what the weekends kind of feel right now. Now, the other part of this too, Nick, second half has not been kind scheduling wise. You've got Denver twice, North Dakota. CC would have been a throwaway game 2 years ago. Now this Tigers team is dangerous and formidable. You get them in the second half of the season when they've been red hot. And how about now a very desperate Duluth team that you're going to see at the tail end of this as well too, Nick? I really didn't answer your question, shocker. But
no, But
Brett,
I mean,
Brett Larson's MO just has to be guys just focused on period of 1 of Friday night, because at some point, and I think Brian Idolski on the women's side was believing this too, and it never came to fruition, but you have to stick with it. It is all about the process. The Huskies have looked a little bit poorer on Friday nights in series, so your goal is to remedy that with the start for period 1 on Friday. If they come with the same game plan they had on Saturday and the same effort level, now step 2 is just buying a bounce, just kind of getting the hockey gods on board a little bit here. There are just some weekends, some stretches that aren't great. This weekend was not good. Regardless of the better start on Saturday, the final result was not good. Brett Larson and company have to be comfortable with sticking to the process, and then if the process still doesn't look that great, being able to accept the fact that at this time of year, man, if you play like dog shit and only put 11 shots on goal and you win 3-2 in overtime, take it. Take it and run with it and bring the positives out of that. I think they just need a gutsy, gritty win on Friday night to kind of right the ship and turn things back on track.
Yeah, and that's more my concern, Noah, is, deficiencies and everything else, aside, it's been a tough stretch, and you do wonder mentally where the players are at, right? Because, if there's one roadblock, that could get in the way of you sticking to the process, it's a lack of confidence right now, right? You do sort of worry. And then when you add on the anxiety and knowing where you're at in terms of the standings, knowing what you're up against, and, I think you and I will both agree any loss in any fashion to Duluth may sink them far enough from the pairwise, albeit it may not look like it on the number scale, but it might do enough damage where unless they win the NCHC tournament, they could be done for the year, right? So it's that to me is a fear, is that they're going into this weekend, and it is, like you said, I think we're both on the same board. This is must-win territory on both nights. They cannot have a night off. And to your point, I think you have to get a little greasy, got to get a little gritty, and you got to get ahead. You got to get a lead. I think if there's anything, that this squad needs more than anything, is not to see the puck go in the back. And then again, they scored a couple times this weekend, but later, right? Not when they need to. And again, I still stand by that. This team, if there's one other area of concern, is that they have not shown the ability to crawl back in the game when they get down, right? And granted, I'm definitely not taking anything away from how good Denver is. They're a good hockey team. So no disrespect to them, but good teams, or I should maybe say great teams, find a way to crawl back, buy a bounce. Because sometimes it's like Wheel of Fortune, Noah, is that it's not that you are getting a lucky bounce, but you're doing enough things where you actually earn.
You're creating them. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, exactly. So, and they just haven't had that this year. So whatever it is, whatever, rain dance this team has to do, honestly, whatever, if you haven't washed your pair of socks all year, now is the time to put them, with some extra Tide, because honestly, anything that you need to do to turn, the luck of the Irish or whatever it is on your side, now is the weekend to do it. And I think, really, to summarize it, Noah, it's essentially now to the end of the year, you got to put it all on the line right now, because if you don't, you may have an early tea time coming up much sooner in your calendar year than maybe you would like.
Well, they're in the exact same spot as the women's team, who did not get the job done. But really, we talked about they had to win 2 games against Bemidji and probably get out of the first round of the playoffs with no less than a single loss in that first round. I think the men's team is in the same boat. You've got to take care of Duluth. You've got to get out and get to the frozen face-off. I think that's kind of where they're at to put themselves in an okay spot. But I mean, the other thing that they have to remember too, yes, you can make adjustments. Yes, you can try to tweak things. Folks, I hate to tell you, this Huskies team is kind of about where they're going to be at. You just got to support the process and understand the best teams in playoff hockey. This is going to sound really stupid, which most of the stuff I say does. But a lot of teams that really do well in playoff hockey. Let's go back to the 2012 LA Kings as an 8 seed. They weren't that good. They found a way to mask the things that made them not good at the right time. That's what playoff teams do, is they're not necessarily the best team, but they find a way at the right time to counter their opponent and play to their strengths and mask their weaknesses. Sometimes you got to have a little bit of that too. We talked about how good were the Huskies down the stretch all of a sudden late last year, winning the frozen faceoff. They probably, if they get a better bounce in the third period of that hockey game against the Gophers, they're probably going to another frozen four last year. They were the better team at the tail end of that game that I was at in Fargo. Just didn't get a bounce. At some point, you just got to, as you mentioned, kind of create your own luck. I want to mention very quickly before we go to the women's team here, Nick, if the playoffs ended today, which
started today.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. If they ended today, we wouldn't be very happy. But starting today, North Dakota is going to get Miami.
Yep.
So it looks like it's either going to be Denver, St. Cloud, or I guess if you really want to be technical about it, CC, although CC and Denver actually have each other. So technically all three of them could have. It would be Duluth in the 7 seed. It's really hard as a Huskies fan because it's like, who do you root for this weekend? Do you want Denver to win or do you want CC to win? Either one's going to pull away or one's going to try to vault you. Still an opportunity for the Huskies to finish in that 2 spot this weekend. Very much so.
They want to split.
Yeah. Or you'd like a Huskies sweep and a CC sweep is the other thing that you would like to as well. But on the other side, that 3 spot, which is now St. Cloud, will likely get Western Michigan or maybe Omaha. It's probably looking like it's going to be closer to Western, although Omaha has, I believe, North Dakota we mentioned this weekend, so things could get interesting. 4 spot right now would be CC and Omaha, so just kind of an interesting little look. This could drastically change by the time we hit the tail end of this show. But moving on over to the women's side here, Nick. Yeah, they did not score a goal on the weekend, and this is one of those things, as we kind of talked about, we looked at the pairwise here on the women's side of things. I mean, they sit at 11, right behind UConn, right ahead of Princeton. We still have 2 conferences that do not, I believe, have anybody in the top 11, and we have conference tournaments still to be finished. So I'm not a math guy. I don't think the math is favorable. I think unless the committee makes a decision or somebody falls out of grace quickly out of that top 10 because of the finish to their conference tournaments, this could be it for the women's team. I think there's a high probability that they unfortunately are just going to be on the outside looking in and not be able to squeak into the tournament. We talked about how important this weekend could have been to push them in that 8 or 9 spot. Duluth moved up to 8 from that 9 spot, so put themselves in a little bit better position as well. But unfortunately just was not to be. The last game for the WCHA first round actually just finished moments ago. It was Minnesota and Mankato, as we kind of alluded to. So why don't we take a look at the WCHA and take a look at the schedule that we saw as we get ready to kind of push into the final push here of the playoff season. As we look at St. Cloud, of course, losing 5-0 on the first night. Wisconsin 4-2 over St. Thomas. Bit of a closer game there. Ohio State trounced Bemidji 10-1. No surprise there. And then Mankato, opening night 5-4 was the final score on that one, despite the fact that the Gophers heavily outshot Mankato. The Gophers responded the next night with a 7-1 victory against Mankato. Ohio State 8-0 against Bemidji. Again, no surprise there. Wisconsin 9-1 over St. Thomas, kind of putting the nail in the coffin. And St. Cloud had a fairly better effort in the next night, but 2-0 was the final. Duluth gets the job done. And then today, the Gophers win 3-0 over Mankato, Nick. So, I mean, we essentially have the top 4 teams, as we were not surprised to see. Ohio State will get Duluth, and then the Gophers and Wisconsin will do battle. The winners of each will get each other in the championship game for the WCHA, Nick. But why don't we start on Friday night for this women's team? Unfortunately, just one of those games that was not the prettiest to look at. Shots 39-20 in favor of Duluth, who wins 5-0, attendance of just under 600. 11-10 in the first, 18-6 in the second, 10-4 in the third. Duluth kind of putting on a clinic in that middle period. 2 for 3 on the power play were the Bulldogs, which has been uncharacteristic for the Huskies all year to give up some special teams on that side of things. 0 for 3 were the Huskies on their own opportunities, who only had 16 face-off wins. 34 face-off losses. Again, the scoring didn't actually get started until that middle period. But yeah, 2-0 after the second, and then 5-0, of course, after the third. A couple of poor bounces as well too, but again, it looked like Duluth was the hungrier team. Sonny Ahola in net got solved for 5 goals, which doesn't happen often this season. And of course, Duluth doing what they had to do. And then on Saturday night, attendance of just under 1,200 in this one. 2-0 was the final score. Shots 27-23 Huskies. Like I said, I mean, St. Cloud kind of gave a bit of pushback in this one. They were outshot 10-6 in the first and then outshoot the Bulldogs 11-7 and 10-6 in periods 2 and 3. Both teams do not earn a power play goal. The Huskies had 3 cracks at it, Duluth just 1, and St. Cloud 25 wins, 20 losses in the dot. So a much better second game. If you want to take the best game out of any game of the 4 that either team played for the Huskies, this was the game. Unfortunately, tail into period number 2, the Bulldogs get on the board, and then early on in period number 3, it's 2-0, and the Bulldogs ride the wave till the end. JoJo Chobak stops 21 of 23, a very strong performance for her, and a very good rebound by the team. But again, as we talked about, just wasn't good enough. And unfortunately, the Huskies, unless some miracle happens, I think mathematically they are probably done, Nick. We'll kind of dissect a little bit more about the season once we kind of have some more information in the coming weeks, Nick. But you kind of mentioned it early on in the open of the show. I really would have loved to have seen this team this weekend with a little bit more confidence they had in the first half of the season and a little bit more health. This team truly did feel like a group entering these games against Duluth, where if they had 2 more healthy bodies and had put a few more games away down the stretch, certainly possible.
It is. And, again, Reagan Bulger and Grace Wolf on the back end, those injuries really stung the Huskies in terms of, essentially their lineup. I mean, first of all, let's say it this way. If they didn't have Clara Himlerova, imagine what it might have looked like, Noah, especially in the back end.
Yeah.
I hate to say it, but as disappointed and I think frustrated as we all are with it, it may have looked a little bit less pretty, especially if Himlerova wasn't available and is willing to essentially do whatever is asked of her. I think if there's anything we have to take away from is just how team first Clara Himlerova has been with this squad, and mid game starting in the back end, or maybe starting up at center, moving back down to the blue line, which, mind you, she's played, she grew up playing defense, so it's natural for her. But the Huskies really were missing the puck-moving defenseman, the player that could skate out of the zone, a player that could jump in on the line rush, could add offense from the blue line, and really just solidify that defensive core. Again, Grace Wolf, a top 4 defenseman, as well as Reagan Bulger. You're down 2. They brought in Carly, I'm gonna forget her name. I'm so sorry. But essentially someone that was supposed to join the Huskies this upcoming year. They brought her in mid-season just because they didn't have a choice, right? And although I know folks will look at the not dressed section of the lineup card and go, well, why don't you dress some of these players? At the end of the day, there's reasons the coaching staff doesn't do those things, red shirting, that kind of thing, eligibility wise. So at the end of the day, I get it. You were in a tough position no matter what. But I do wonder, Noah, like you said, the first half, the Huskies looked like a different team. This team looked like it was destined to get to 20 wins. This team had great showings against the Gophers, against UMD. They took a victory away from Ohio State. And then all of a sudden, the second half of the season came, and their offense not just went dry, they went Death Valley dry. I mean, it was completely down and out. And that, if there's any big turning point, that's where it was for this Husky squad.
Nick, it's interesting that you mentioned that. So the Huskies, second half of the season, so essentially January 12th onward, the Huskies go 5-11, 4 regulation wins, 1 shootout win, which was a 1-0 victory technically. St. Cloud, only in 4 games out of those entire essentially 16 hockey games, only had 4 of them in which they scored 3 or more goals, and they were all the victories they had: 4-2, 3-1, 5-1, 6-2. the 2 games against Bemidji State last weekend, early recovery victory against Mankato 4-2, and the opening Friday against St. Thomas before they lost 5-1 the following night. 9 of those losses coming in the regular season, and then of course the 2 last weekend. St. Cloud in, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4 of those hockey games were blanked. Didn't even score a goal. I mean, you look at that compared to where they were at, and they weren't blowing teams out of the water, but they were comfortable winning games even with maybe 2 or 3 goals where they were 2-0, 3-1, things like that, riding off of good goaltending and good defensive play. Offense was totally and 110% the name of the game, because this team, for as good as they were offensively and the adjustments that they made compared to last season, they had exceptional goaltending, which has been a staple of St. Cloud women's hockey for a number of years now. Yep. And they really had an increased commitment to their defensive structure and posture, the ability to handle the ebb and flow and transitional play of a hockey game and be able to stay staunch defensively, defend when you had to, transition out when they needed to. I still think that aspect was really good. But if it was a game that got over 3 goals, this women's team just didn't have enough firepower in the tank to kind of get back. You talked about it, Clara Himlerova also having to move to the back end, moving over into the second half of the season. You can't rely on players like Emma Gentry can't put up 20 in the second half of the season to try to keep the team afloat. At some point, the collective has to find a way to put the puck in the back of the net. And as much as they talk about defense wins championships versus fighting fire with fire and having good offensive pushes, I don't know anybody that looks at a team like the Toronto Maple Leafs and says, boy, it must suck to put up 7 every night. Like, yes, right. they lose games 8-7 sometimes, but it's like you at least know half of the equation is there. Doesn't matter how good you are defensively. At some point, you got to put the puck in the net. At some point, you have to score to win hockey games. Again, stupid, obvious things Noah Grant says on the Huskies Warming House podcast. You got about a month left to listen to it, so tune in. But Nick, this women's team was very much a case of, we looked at them, they finished with 17 wins. You throw in the playoff losses, 17 losses, and then 2 overtime finishes. Oh, this team was just so close to climbing that extra step to getting to 20 or 21 wins. They were right there, Nick.
I know.
They were right there, and that's what makes this weekend so disappointing. And my fear entering the weekend was exactly this. Not that the women's team was going to play bad, because even Friday, I think, was a kind of mess. Saturday, they pushed back a little bit. This Duluth women's program in the past 5 years has learned this skill exceptionally well. Is they look at an animal that is slightly wounded, and I guess, quote unquote, they got that dog in them, and they just they put the hammer down. And they've done that repeatedly in the playoffs, where you give them an inch and they take a mile. And credit to that Duluth program, because what they've built in the last 5 years really came out this weekend, is their ability to just crack the door open a little bit and then burst wide in and be able to take care of business and not let it get to a third game. I think if the Huskies get that Saturday game and come back in that one, all bets are off entering today. But Nick, I mean, how do you kind of take a look at last weekend and kind of recap the second half of the season that unfortunately was a bit of a polar opposite from the success that we saw in the first half?
I think the word you can probably summarize it is frustrating, right? Yeah. Because I think you can use it to describe how frustrated you were at the state of the roster, right? You can't do anything about it. It's injuries. It happens to every team. But you were frustrated that you could not find a way to overcome that. You were frustrated in the fact that you had a lot of close games, Noah. Yeah. Let's not forget that there were a ton of games where the Huskies were in, but they just, again, couldn't get the supplemental offense to get themselves on the right side of the win-loss column, right? And I think you could see the frustration with Idalski in the last home series as we interviewed him, that he saw it. I think he repeated it how many times, right? And that is, we got to score. It's that simple. We're doing everything else, but we just can't get the puck in between the pipes right now. And I know that, speaking to him in that last press conference, he talked about how the program, in terms of building it up to where Duluth is, right? And we don't know the fate of the Huskies, right, in terms of their NCAA fate. Although, as you mentioned, the math is looking not too kind at the moment. You never know until the dotted line is signed, or as Noah Grant likes to say, until someone sings and he hasn't warmed up his vocal cords yet. But at the end of the day, Noah, I think there's a lot of frustration that's going around that locker room right now, just because, again, this team was on a very good trajectory to the first half. And then with factors beyond their control to a degree, it put them in a position to probably change a few things up, and they never were able to recreate that first half magic. And that's what's frustrating, because if this is indeed, and we'll say this breakdown, obviously, once the season is officially done, whether it is officially announced later or they do get a game, who knows, right? But there's a lot of veteran presence that's going to be leaving this program. And that is unfortunate, because it's going to be a much younger squad coming up next year.
Nick, you mentioned it perfectly. I was just trying to do some quick math, which is always a dangerous proposition. But out of the 11 losses, including the playoff games last weekend, that this women's team had, one of them was a 5-goal spread. One of them was a 4-goal spread.
Yep.
One was a 3-goal spread. 2 were decided by 2 goals. 6 of them were 1-goal contests.
Yep.
6 of those losses. And I would imagine if you threw probably at least one of the 2-goal games and maybe even that 3-goal game, I wouldn't be shocked if you had an empty netter or 2 in there as well. That's just it. And we're going to talk about, we're getting all the negativity out in case you haven't figured this out. If this team truly is done, we've got a lot of positive things to say about this group coming up next week, and really want to recap what was otherwise a very good season and a very entertaining season, and a lot of refreshing hope and promise, I think, for this program. And especially as the new cycle, as Nick has alluded to, and the new wave comes in, Brian Idalski is going to get his first real chance in year number 3 to really kind of start to build from the ground up. It might take a year or 2 or 3, but we're going to start to see that first kind of incoming of a group that's going to get like the total tutelage, so to speak, essentially, of the coaching staff, and be able to see over 4 years how this program gets built up. Again, similar to Duluth, it might take them a couple years, 3, 4, 5 years to kind of get to that spot. But again, trusting in the process, I think, is going to be the name of the game. And we'll dissect a little bit more. Like I said, I think we want to save a lot of it until we truly know that they are done, which mathematically, just from everything that we've seen in years past, I'm going to probably say there's probably a 95% chance that is the case. Miracles have happened before. We are coming out of February. We've seen a couple of those, maybe about 40 some odd years ago. But
and Noah, you mentioned, back that, Duluth at one point was 13th and the committee picked them. The flip side argument to the Huskies is they limped to the finish line.
Yeah.
So you do wonder, even if maybe even by math standards, there is a glimmer of hope. You do wonder if with their recent performances, if that doesn't sway the vote enough to get them into that final spot. You never know. We don't know who makes those decisions. We can hope. There is still a chance technically. And we hope that they get one. No, and I think, how big of a redemption, let's play the card while we have it, right? How big of a redemption would it be for St. Cloud to essentially take this little break to get themselves to be that 8th seed like the Los Angeles Kings, and just to participate in that game? I'm not saying that they could win, right?
Technically the play-in seed,
right. But they could, right? And I think even if you don't win that game, I think even Idalski would be happy with the fact that they got that opportunity, because how many times do we say this in any level of sports, right? Sometimes you just got to go through the motions. You got to go through what that game feels like.
Yeah.
Then that makes you go, okay. And Idalski mentioned it too. He goes, we don't have anybody that's in this room that has essentially been there and say, it's okay, we can come back. We can beat this team, because they haven't done it yet. So it's more about, I'm not sure if this is the best way to phrase it, but almost like, sort of setting a new expectation, breaking boundaries in a sense, where it's, let's get our feet wet in an NCAA game, play-in game, whatever you call it, right? Because at the end of the day, that experience, especially for some of the young talent that is on this squad, that is very good young talent, let's not forget that, Noah.
Yeah.
when you do start to build around it. And I still think St. Cloud's going to be very active in the transfer portal this offseason. I really do. But imagine what that experience would look like. And as they go into next season, even regular season, when you're playing the Gophers, Ohio State, Wisconsin, Minnesota, how that experience can be used even in a regular season close game, right? So
yeah,
we'll cross our fingers, but we'll see.
Well, and knowing that you're going to get good goaltending entering next season, you maybe dip it in the transfer portal, you grab maybe a veteran defenseman or two, just shore up some defensive depth there, have a couple of experienced bodies there, and then, hopefully a good incoming freshman class and maybe pick up a goal scorer or two and things. Again, as we mentioned, a lot of turnover coming on this roster, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be a bad thing. We've seen mixes come in before. You talked about a player like Clara Hemlerova, the best statistical freshman class in St. Cloud women's hockey history. We alluded to it when we were there a couple of years ago with their point production, and they didn't exactly have an otherworldly season in terms of the actual standings and conference play. So a lot of things to be proud of, a lot of things that we're going to break down. I think it's just, from our frustration, we've been covering this group, 4.5, 5 years now, essentially. And it's just like, this was the group that felt like they had the biggest chance, and they could not buy one in the second half, unfortunately. And again, just looking at the pairwise, that could be all she wrote, unfortunately. I would love, as you mentioned, to see them get one more kick at the can, just to have the ability to kind of truly fight for their own fate in single game elimination and have that opportunity. But nonetheless, congrats to the Duluth Bulldogs, as well as Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Ohio State, all very good first round series. Also, how about Mankato pushing the Gophers into an uncomfortable spot? As we mentioned, they are the X factor, are the Gophers entering this tournament. They are very much beatable, so should be interesting to see how they match up close to home, essentially, against the Wisconsin Badgers, which that game in years past has been fireworks galore, so should be interesting. And the other question is, can Duluth pull off the upset, and how good are the Buckeyes really? Are they everything that we think that they are? So should be very interesting as we take a look at that. On the other side, speaking of Bulldogs, Minnesota Duluth on the docket. The men are on the road for their last games in the NCHC regular season. I would say they probably need them both as they head into the playoff round the following week. For Nick Maxon, I'm Noah Grant, and we will see you soon in the Den.
One-timer coming, they score! Ripped in! A bomb from Perrix!
So Dana Rasmussen fires and she scores! Dana Rasmussen for the Huskies alongside
Dwayne Kaprizov in for a chance to win it! He scores! Kirill the Thrill is for real! Welcome to the NHL!
Cathedral is now 42.6 seconds away from wrapping up the school's first ever title.